Some folks like to get away, take a holiday from the neighborhood, hop a flight to Miami Beach or to Hollywood. But I'm taking a Greyhound on the Hudson River line. I'm in a New York state of mind. I've seen all those movie stars and those fancy cars and those limousines. Been high in the Rockies or the Evergreens. But I know what I'm needing, and I don't want to waste no time. I'm in a New York state of mind. It was so easy living day by day, out of touch with the rhythm and blues. And now I need a little give and take. The New York Times and the Daily News. Come down to reality, and it's fine with me, 'cause I let it slide. I don't care if it's Chinatown or the Riverside. I don't have any reasons, I've left them all behind. I'm in a New York state of mind. Yeah, yeah. It was so easy living day by day, out of touch with the rhythm and blues. Oh, and now I need a little give and take. The New York Times and the Daily News. Ooh, comes down to reality, and it's fine with me, 'cause I let it slide. I don't care if it's Chinatown or the Riverside. I don't have any reasons, I've left them all behind. I'm in a New York state of mind. In a New York state of mind. I don't have any reasons, I've left them all behind. I'm in a New York state of mind.
New York State of Mind, the love letter to New York, written by Billy Joel on the Turnstiles album. The story goes that Billy Joel, New York born and raised songwriter, piano player extraordinaire, now a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, spent a few years living in Los Angeles and realized he couldn't live out in LA. He loved New York too much. Goes back to New York, gets on a bus. Immediately, the idea for the song comes to his brain. When he gets to his wife's house, his girlfriend's house, he runs in and says, I just have this song. I got to write it down. Turns out to be New York State of Mind, one of the greatest songs written about New York, an amazing state, an amazing city, my home. I'm a born and raised New Yorker, and I'm thrilled for the opportunity to tell you about my favorite state in the United States, New York. My name is Jason Steinhauer, and we can put up the slides. I will thank the American Center in Moscow for the opportunity to be a part of this series. And as it says here, I heart New York. I love New York. I was born and raised there. And my job here today is not just to tell you about New York City, which some of you may be familiar with, but to tell you about the entirety of New York State and why it is such an incredible, amazing, complex, and diverse place. So let's get into it. First of all, this is what New York looks like as a state. It is actually the 27th largest state in the US by size. But even though it's, 27th out of 50th, so in the scheme of American states, it's on the smaller side. It has the fourth largest population, about 20 million people. And an interesting fact about New York and Hawaii are the only two states where more than half the population live on islands. That's right. New York City, Manhattan is an island, and Long Island, that comprises about 50% of the population of New York. And the remaining population, about 50%, lives in the rest of New York, what we call upstate New York. And I'm here to tell you today that upstate New York is an absolutely fascinating and beautiful place that is worth your time to visit if you ever get the chance. So 27th largest state, but fourth largest by population with about 20 million people. It's the 11th state established in the United States, 11th out of 50, established in 1788. And because it has so many people, it actually has 28 electoral votes in the Electoral College. Now, some of you may be familiar with how we decide our presidential elections here in the United States. We do it by something called the Electoral College, where every state in the Union, including the District of Columbia, has a certain number of electoral votes given to it, assigned to it based on population. So because New York is a highly populated state, it has a significant number of Electoral College votes. It has 28 out of the 538 total that are needed to win the presidency. So New York plays an important role in American politics, as well as in a number of other areas of American life that we'll talk about soon. I mentioned its size. So New York, even though it's 27 out of 50, it's a big state, 54,000 square miles. For those of you who do kilometers, that's about 141,000 square kilometers. It's actually larger than 120 other countries. So New York State is larger than Greece, larger than Bulgaria, larger than Portugal, larger than South Korea, and larger than the United Arab Emirates. And this is an interesting fact that some folks may not be aware of. 13% of New York State is actually water, about 7,000 square miles. And water plays a huge role in the geography and topography of New York State, as well as its history. So with that, let's get into looking at some of the water and the geography of New York State and how that has shaped the state and its history. Let's go to the map if we can, and I'm going to pull up a map here so that we all can take a look at it. All right, hopefully you can all see this. This is a map of New York State. So as you can see, New York City is down here, along with Long Island and Westchester County, which is the suburbs of New York, just above New York City. But New York, as we said, big state, 54,000 miles. So there's a lot of territory to cover up here. So we're going to start at the top and we're going to work our way down. And at the top of New York is a beautiful, beautiful lake called Lake Champlain. You can see it here on the map. Lake Champlain is actually partially in Vermont, which is right next door to New York. It's partially in New York State, and it actually helps form the border with Canada as well. This is Quebec, the province of Quebec, here in Canada. Lake Champlain is an important lake for a lot of reasons. It supplies the drinking water to 200,000 plus people. It has 318 species of birds. It has 90 plus species of fish. It's as deep as 400 feet, and it's 120 miles in length. It's also a beautiful lake. You can see some of the pictures if you go to Google Maps and come down here. You can see that Lake Champlain is actually a breathtaking place. These gorgeous sunsets that happen over the lake. There are 71 islands in Lake Champlain alone. And this lake was actually created during the Ice Age, or after the Ice Age. There was ice and glaciers all over New York State. And as that ice retreated, it created an inlet, which was called the Champlain, well, which we call today the Champlain Sea, and which shrunk into eventually a Champlain Lake. Now, the lake itself is named after the French explorer, Samuel de Champlain. And you may think about the French explorers as being solely in Canada or other parts of North America. But if you look across New York State, across Vermont over here, and even as you go further west into Michigan and Wisconsin and other areas that border Canada, there's a lot of French influence. There's a lot of towns that have French names. There's a lot of evidence of French explorers and traders who operated in those areas. And New York is no exception. So some of the names in upstate New York have French heritage, others have tribal or indigenous heritage, and others have, of course, British and Dutch heritage. Now, if we can go back to the slides for just 1 second, Lake Champlain is also famous for something else, and it actually has its own monster in the lake. Now, some of you might be familiar with the Loch Ness Monster in Scotland, but Lake Champlain is also alleged and rumored to have its own monster named Champ, and you can hopefully see him here on the screen. The earliest sightings of Champ, of course, he wasn't called Champ at the time, were actually by indigenous tribes who claimed that they saw a monster or some kind of being operating in the lake, and they warned the French explorers about this alleged monster in the lake. Samuel de Champlain himself actually has a diary entry where he describes seeing said alleged monsters, and there have been hundreds of alleged sightings of said monster over the centuries and decades. Now, whether Champ actually exists or whether this is some large fish or a large mammal or just a figment of all of our imaginations, I will leave it to you to decide, but it is worth noting that there is actually a law in New York State that protects Champ as a species, even though he's never been officially confirmed to exist. So that's one of the lakes, one of the bodies of water that have helped shape New York's history. Let's talk about another one, and that is Lake George. So if we go back to the map, I will show you where Lake George is. So this was Lake Champlain up here. And if we go into the map, I will show you Lake George, which is a little bit further down. This is Lake George. And Lake George is another one of New York's fascinating and beautiful lakes. Lake George itself is 32 miles long. It goes up to 200 feet deep. It's among the cleanest and clearest lakes in the world. It was also formed about 10,000 years ago by melting glaciers. And actually, Thomas Jefferson himself described Lake George as being, quote, without comparison, the most beautiful water I ever saw. So according to Thomas Jefferson, the most beautiful water that he ever saw is in New York State. Now, half of the forest around New York State is actually protected by the New York State Constitution, and there are special state laws that protect Lake George Park. But Lake George and Lake Champlain are not the only lakes worth talking about in New York State. There's also a whole region called the Finger Lakes, and you can see them here on this map. Over here, over here, over here. They are long, slender lakes that look like fingers. And in fact, the Iroquois tribal nations that lived in this area, they believed that the lakes were actually formed by the Great Spirit, reaching down to bless the land and leaving the impression of fingerprints filled with clear, fresh water. Modern geologists actually believe that these lakes were also formed by melting glaciers, carving into the land. But the Finger Lakes region of New York, which is a really important region, which we'll talk about historically, it coming up in a little bit, this region actually spans as long as the entire state of Massachusetts. So this is a big part of New York State. And there are three large lakes here, Cayuga, Seneca, and Canandaigua. Now, Seneca might be familiar to some of you who are history buffs because Seneca Falls is actually the birth of the modern women's rights movement. So the birth of the modern women's rights movement actually begins in New York State because there is a Seneca Falls Convention that happens in 1848. And there's a lot of history in this region that we will talk about coming up. New York is also a Great Lakes state. Some of you might be familiar with the Great Lakes in the United States. We have 5 massive lakes that are as large as some seas in the United States. And 2 of those lakes, Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, actually touch New York. Lake Ontario has a large border with New York, as you can see here, and Lake Erie also has a sizable border with New York until it starts to reach into Pennsylvania and later Ohio. The Great Lakes, we could do a whole program just on the Great Lakes, but the Great Lakes are an amazing ecosystem from that combined between the United States and Canada, and they actually hold 21% of the world's fresh water resources. So 21% of the world's freshwater resources are in the Great Lakes, 2 of which touch New York. And there's about 250 different species of fish in these lakes as well. They are recognized as national treasures. And some of you may know that between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario is something called Niagara Falls, which is also part of New York. It's also part of Canada, but it's also part of New York. Niagara Falls is a modern wonder. Some of you have probably seen these pictures online or have heard about Niagara Falls. Maybe you've even been to Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls is the oldest state park in the United States. It was created in 1885. More than 3,000 tons of water flows over Niagara Falls every second. I'll say that again. 3,000 tons of water flows over Niagara Falls every second. It produces over 4 million kilowatts of electricity. And 4 of the 5 Great Lakes actually drain into this river, via this passageway from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario. These falls were also formed by the last ice age, glaciers retreating, forming this whole region. The first Europeans to see and describe the falls was actually a man named Father Louis Hennepin, also a French priest, who accompanied La Salle on his expedition to the Niagara region in 1678. Approximately 14 million people visit Niagara Falls every year. So if you do get a chance to visit New York State, please treat yourself to seeing one of the modern wonders of the world, which is Niagara Falls. Now, naturally, when you have all these lakes and waterfalls, you also have rivers, and rivers are crucially important to New York as well. So one of the most important rivers to New York is up here, the St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence River actually forms the barrier, a boundary between New York and Canada, and it runs close to 1,200 kilometers in length, and it carries about 20% of the Earth's fresh surface water. So basically all that water that's coming out of the Great Lakes over the falls into Lake Ontario then goes along the St. Lawrence River until eventually empties out into the bay and then into the ocean. So this is a vital waterway, not just for New York, but for the world in general. But perhaps the most important river in New York, which is one that you may have heard of, is the Hudson River. Now, the Hudson River starts up here in the mountains and flows all the way down past New York City and then into New York Harbor and out into the ocean. The Hudson River is one of the nation's 14 American heritage rivers. And the indigenous peoples that lived in New York State, still live in New York State, they actually called this river the river that flows 2 ways. So why would they call it a river that flows 2 ways? Well, it's because they understood that the Hudson River was actually much more than just a river. It's actually a tidal estuary. And so what does that mean? It basically means that salt water from the ocean actually comes up the Hudson River at the same time that fresh water from the mountains actually comes down the Hudson River. And so you can actually feel the pulse of the ocean in the Hudson River, and the water levels actually rise and fall with the tide. So at rising tide, the water flows north, and as in falling tide, the water actually flows south. Hence, you have a river that flows in two directions. You actually have salt water that pushes up from New York City all the way as far north as Poughkeepsie over here, and then eventually comes back down into the ocean. So this has created a vibrant ecosystem, one that actually included oysters. If you look at the early writings of Dutch and British who arrived in what became New York, they talk about oysters that were growing in the Hudson River and all the oyster farming and fishing that the indigenous tribes did along that river. There's also 200 species of fish and bald eagles and herons and all kinds of wildlife that live around the Hudson River. And if we can go back to the slideshow for one more minute, I can show you that actually the Hudson River is also the only river that I know of in the United States that has its own art school associated with it, the Hudson River School. This was an artistic fraternity from the 19th century. It was based on a group of New York City-based landscape artists who would travel up the Hudson River to paint these gorgeous views. And you can see one of the gorgeous views here in the slide. These were artists such as Thomas Cole, Frederick Edwin Church, Albert Bierstadt, and Asher B. Durand. And you can find Hudson River School paintings in museums all across the United States and indeed around the world. They're some of the most beautiful environmental paintings that you will ever see. They're sort of building on this idea, this artistic idea that was popular in the 19th century of the sublime, the idea, the beauty of nature overwhelming you. And so that starts on the Hudson River, but it then continues, and you find these artists painting similar paintings of the American West, of the Andes in South America, and other gorgeous locations that have mountains around the world. So the Hudson River School is actually a very important artistic movement, and again, named after the Hudson River in New York State. Hopefully you see why I continue to say that New York State is in fact the best and coolest state in the Union. One last river that I'll mention that's important, we also in New York have the beginnings of the Delaware River. The Delaware River begins in Hancock, New York, and then it flows through New Jersey and eventually Pennsylvania. The Delaware River is a famous river because Washington crossed the Delaware during the American Revolutionary War. Some of you may know that from your American history class. Now, Washington crossing the Delaware actually happens in New Jersey, and the Delaware Water Gap, which is a famous natural area in the United States, is actually between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, so not New York specific, but the river itself does start in New York. All right, we've talked about some of the waterways. We're going to come back to those. They're important for other reasons apart from the topography and the landscape and the environmental. But when you have rivers, you also have mountains. So I'm going to go back to the map one more time, and I want to show you some of the mountain ranges in New York State. And again, the mountains are going to play an important role in New York's history and development. The first mountain range that I want to talk about is the Adirondacks. The Adirondacks are a gorgeous series of mountains and mountain ranges in upstate New York. You see them here. The Adirondacks comprise 1/3 of the total land area of New York State. So 1/3 of that 54,000 square miles is actually the Adirondack Mountains. These are vast, vast areas with various peaks, valleys, lakes. It's really a gorgeous area, again, to explore. So if you do find yourself in New York and you have some time, I recommend renting a car or taking a bus upstate and exploring the Adirondacks. There's wildflowers, There's hundreds and hundreds of species of shrubs and herbs and grasses and trees. It's really an amazing, amazing scenery. And I think usually on Google Maps, they give you a few pictures of the Adirondacks. So you can see some of what this looks like here with these gorgeous, gorgeous mountains and historic towns inside the Adirondacks. Definitely worth a visit. And you can do a Google image search to find your own pictures of the Adirondacks. And a little bit lower down from the Adirondacks, you have another mountain range called the Catskill Mountains. And the Catskill Mountains are also beautiful. That painting that I just showed you was a landscape view from the Catskill Mountains along the Hudson River here. But the Catskill Mountains have about 700,000 acres of protected forests. You can ski in the Catskills. You can hike in the Catskills. There are beautiful waterfalls in the Catskills. And interestingly, in addition to being an escape for New York artists like the Hudson River School, over time, the Catskills also became an escape for people who lived in New York City in crowded, congested, dirty conditions, which we'll talk about, and needed country air and a country escape. And so from the 19th century into the 20th century, so we're talking about the 1800s and the 1900s, the Catskills begin to emerge as a place where people from New York City go to spend weekends, go to spend summers, go to escape the city heat, the city crowds, and to, in some cases, recuperate and breathe fresher country air. And among those families that would take advantage of the Catskills was actually my family. So my grandmother, before she passed away, we did an oral history with her, and she talked about how she and other immigrant families, poor immigrant families at that, would go up to the Catskills to escape New York City and rent these little bungalows. And these bungalows were in Yiddish called they were called a kokeline. And a kokeline literally means to cook alone, because these bungalows came equipped with a little kitchen. And you would have these stories about all these Jewish families from New York City going up to the bungalows of the Catskills and cooking in these little small huts with their own little kitchens. And if we can go back to the slides, I actually do have a little photo of that I want to show you. This is a photograph not of my family, but of another Jewish family that was published in a magazine a few years ago. You can see this little bungalow here in the Catskills and this working class family that has escaped here for the weekend. So the Catskills has some very important history in my own family, but also broader for working class New Yorkers coming down from the city up to the country. There were also very famous resorts and casinos and nightclubs in the Catskills, something called the Borscht Belt. You can actually look up the Borscht Belt Museum. There's a Borscht Belt Museum in the Catskills that tells the history of the resorts and casinos and nightclubs and comedy shows and musical acts who all passed through the Catskills at various times. So the Catskill Mountains, in addition to their beauty, also have a really fascinating history. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the history of New York now that we've gotten a sense of the landscape. Obviously, yes, I have the slides out of order, so I'm going to advance to slide 13 here. Obviously, the New York State is settled by Europeans. We have French, we have Dutch, we have British. But before Europeans arrived, the territory that we call New York State today was inhabited by tribal indigenous populations. And those tribal communities, populations included the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, the Tuscaroras, the Lenape. And then on the previous slide, you can actually see some of the tribes that also lived on Long Island. You have, it's a little bit hard for me to read, but you can see you have the Canarsies, you have the Manhassets, you have the Montauks. Many of these tribal nations, their names still exist. So if you go to South Brooklyn, you will find a neighborhood called Canarsie. If you go to the end of Long Island, you will find an area called Montauk. And of course, some of these tribal nations still live in New York, although many others were decimated by wars and conflicts between them and European settlers. On Long Island, for example, these tribal nations, many of them were whalers and deep sea fishermen. They had dwellings. You can see, obviously, there's canoes and boats that they built. And these tribes actually, from what we can tell, it looks like they probably had some sort of an island-wide confederation or an agreement, collaboration among them, where they kind of each respected their own boundaries and understood sort of where each one operated. You also had something similar upstate with the what was called the Iroquois Confederacy, with some of these tribes that I mentioned earlier, the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, etc. And during the American War of Independence against Great Britain, some of the tribes declared neutrality, and some of the other tribes actually sided with the British because they had these American colonists who were encroaching on their traditional lands and historic lands. And so they thought if they sided with the British, they might be able to force out the American colonists. Well, in New York in particular, that prompted a particularly bloody response from George Washington, who was leading the American armies at the time. And he actually sends a very famous note to a general named General Sullivan, who basically calling for the complete destruction of some of these indigenous tribes living in upstate New York in 1779. So unfortunately, our American history has some not so great stories in its past of these types of encounters where American colonists and American armies did horrible damage to these indigenous populations and on their traditional ancestral homelands. But there is a treaty that is signed in 1794, and you're seeing a representation of that treaty here in the painting. And this treaty sort of declares understanding and mutual agreement between the Iroquois and what was becoming the U.S. government. And it's signed in upstate New York in Canandaigua, New York. Now, I mentioned that Canandaigua earlier as one of the Finger Lakes, right? So the Finger Lakes region, again, playing an important role in New York history. And that treaty that was signed actually granted land rights and self-governing rights to tribal nations. And that agreement is still enacted today, even though there have been violations of that. And so some of these tribal nations do still live in New York and claim those ancestral lands as their homelands. Others live in other parts of the United States, but they still see this part of New York as their ancestral homeland. I mentioned the American Revolutionary War. Well, New York State plays an important role in the war for independence. The Hudson River during the war was actually called the quote unquote key to the continent because basically all goods had to cross that river, whether they were coming from the east to the west or the west to the east. So it was an important strategic point, and a lot of battles are fought up and down the Hudson River. There's actually a battle of Long Island. There's a battle of White Plains. That's what you're seeing here in this image, a painting of the Battle of White Plains, where the British Army eventually forces their way up a hill and forces Washington to retreat up the Hudson River. And ultimately, the turning point for the war, the most important battle in the war, some historians argue, is the Battle of Saratoga, which also happens in New York State. It's a turning point because the Americans are able to defeat the British, and because of that victory, it encourages France to join the war on the side of the American colonists as a way to defeat their archenemy, Great Britain. And so many historians argue that that tips the scales in favor of the Americans in the war and eventually leads to America winning the war and declaring independence, the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So again, New York plays a pivotal role. Battle that turned the American War for Independence happens in New York, in Saratoga, New York. Now, once America becomes independent and New York becomes a state, then it enters a period where New York becomes an industrial and commercial center. And again, we're going to talk about New York City in a little bit. Obviously, New York City becomes a hub for commerce and for industry. But New York State is also critical to this. And one of the main innovations that helps make New York State critical to America's industrial and commercial renaissance is the Erie Canal. Some of you may have heard about the Erie Canal in your history classes, or you may be familiar with it from information you've seen online. The Erie Canal is in New York State. It goes across New York State in some of the key areas of the geography that I showed you earlier, right? The Hudson River, which is here, these waterways, which make up the Erie Canal, go through the Finger Lakes, and eventually they lead to Lake Erie. And from Lake Erie, they then go to the western United States, states like Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and further west. So what does the Erie Canal do? Why is it important? Why is this chain of waterways important? Well, part of the way that you grow your economy, you grow your industry, you grow your ability to become a commercial and industrial center is by being able to get goods back and forth from point A to point B. And I mentioned the Adirondack Mountains. Well, the mountains that are the Adirondacks actually continue on into Pennsylvania. They become the Poconos, then they become the Appalachian Mountains. So the only way to get across those mountains and to get goods from point A to point B, from east to west, is right here across upstate New York in what would become the Erie Canal, going through these series of rivers, the Mohawk River into the Great Lakes to Lake Erie, and then onward west from there. That makes New York a critical state for commerce and getting goods from the west to the east and from the east to the west. And once you get them across the Appalachians, then you can get them down the Hudson River, which we talked about earlier, and into New York City, out to the rest of the world, and vice versa, from New York City up the Hudson River, across the Erie Canal, and then to the rest of the United States. So this is critical to making New York the financial, industrial, and commercial capital of the world. The New York City that you know today is not possible without the Hudson River, the Erie Canal, and that connective tissue that brings goods from point A to point B. And because of the Erie Canal and this commercial activity, you have all kinds of industry that pop up in New York. And eventually, into the late 19th century, into the 20th century, some of the most iconic industries that you may have heard of and that we grew up with as Americans come from New York State and this particular region. General Electric, Kodak, Xerox, Jello. These are all companies that had headquarters in New York. There was a huge manufacturing that happens in New York State. This is a picture of the West Point Foundry, which is also along those waterways that I just talked about. There's a huge iron and steel industry that grows up in New York that requires enormous amounts of natural resources, by the way, natural resources that eventually end up being used to pollute things like the Hudson River. You have coal, you have timber, you have water, you have entire towns that grow up around these industries. And these forges make all kinds of, and in fact, I was just traveling in Maine and I saw a piece of metalwork that was stamped with Troy, New York on it. So these New York metal industries end up going to supply areas across the country. And I talked about General Electric. Eventually, in the 1920s, General Electric, which is headquartered in New York at the time, they innovate and eventually have the first television broadcast. And the first television broadcast actually happens in 1927, 1928 in upstate New York. There's a guy named Dr. Ernst Frederick Werner Alexanderson, who demonstrates how you can send radio television signals from one location into the homes of other locations. That happens in Schenectady, New York, upstate. You also have a huge glass industry that develops. Corning Glass, very, very famous. There's actually a museum there called the Corning Glass Museum. There was a guy named Thomas Edison who invented, electricity and made light bulbs, and Corning Glass made the glass for those light bulbs. There's an entire region of New York that was just dedicated to glass and glass making, glass cookware. At one point, the nickname is Crystal City for as much glass is produced there. And this doesn't even mention Tiffany glass. Some of you may be familiar with the company Tiffany that makes beautiful stained glass windows or beautiful lamps. Tiffany glass actually comes from the lower New York area, New York City. But New York as a state is responsible for so much beautiful and high quality glass that gets produced in the 19th and 20th century. There are other industries that grow up along these lakes and rivers and Erie Canal as well. May not be particularly obvious, but New York has a lot of wineries, 471 wineries that eventually emerge in New York. New York becomes the second highest apple producer in the United States. New York actually has the most tappable maple trees in the U.S. Many people think about maple syrup as coming exclusively from Vermont, but a lot of it comes from New York. And people may not think about New York as a large dairy state, but actually it's the fourth largest dairy state in the U.S. So New York's topography, its mountains, its rivers, its landscape, the Erie Canal, the Hudson River, it leads to the development of so much industry and commerce that is part of what creates the New York that we know today. Now, the other thing that the Erie Canal does is it allows for the movement, not just of goods, but of people. And that region of upstate New York that I showed you, where the Erie Canal and the Finger Lakes are and the Great Lakes are, that region comes to be known as something called the burnt over district. So what does that mean? Well, basically, during the 1800s, there was a huge movement of revivalists across that part of New York State. Revivalists, basically, what we're talking about is religious revivals, largely Protestant Christianity religious revivals happening across that entire region. And at one point, someone says that across upstate New York, there are no more souls to convert. Right? It's been totally burnt over, which is why it gets this nickname of the burnt over district. But interestingly enough, there's a lot of religions that begin in upstate New York. One of them is Mormonism. So if you've ever heard of the Mormons or the Church of Latter-day Saints, that begins in upstate New York during this period of massive religious revival that we call the Second Great Awakening. Also, the spiritualist movement, the modern spiritualist movement, begins in a place called Hydesville, New York. There's something called the Chautauqua movement. The Chautauqua movement in 1874 begins in Chautauqua Lake, New York, and it's Methodist by origin, but it grows to expand beyond that. But it's all about teaching and learning and showing people how to use their leisure time to avoid drinking and gambling, and to promote like moral health and good health. And this spawns an entire movement, as I said, called the Chautauqua movement. Their Chautauquas grow from outside of New York to extend to other states, but that movement actually begins in upstate New York. These are all movements that are based in Protestantism, but of course, not to be outdone, New York becomes a huge home for Catholics as well. Catholics begin in New York as a tiny religious minority that begin facing widespread persecution, actually. But in 1643, there's a French Jesuit missionary who visits what was then New Amsterdam, would become New York, and he found only 2 Catholic inhabitants. It's hard to believe that at one point there was a New York that only had 2 Catholics in it. By the end of the Revolutionary War, there's only a couple hundred Catholics in New York, but that changes in the 1800s, the 19th century, with the arrival of Irish immigrants. Irish immigrants who come to New York City in the 19th century are overwhelmingly Catholic. They create a huge Catholic community and Catholic infrastructure in New York. And then in the second half of the 19th century, there's a huge influx of Italian immigrants who are also Catholic, as well as Catholics from other countries like Croatia and Albania and other parts of Southern and Eastern Europe. So by the 20th century, New York has a huge Catholic population. There are entire Catholic neighborhoods. There are very famous Catholic cathedrals like St. Patrick's Cathedral. Some people may have heard of that. Actually, the first Catholic to become a major party candidate for president is a New Yorker, Al Smith. And today, one of the largest property owners in New York City behind the government and Columbia University is actually the Catholic Church. And the image that you're seeing here is actually a festival that happens in New York City every year in Little Italy, which is the annual feast of San Gennaro, another Catholic celebration that happens in New York, and that is a hallmark of New York. And finally, when we talk about religion, of course, in New York, we have to talk about Jewish immigrants as well. So the first Jews actually arrived in New York in 1654 with 23 refugees coming from Recife, Brazil. They were actually fleeing the Inquisition. So Brazil at one point was a Dutch colony, and the Dutch were more tolerant of Jewish practice. But when the Portuguese took over, the Inquisition came with them, and that forced Jews to flee, and they wound up in New Amsterdam, which at that point was owned by the Dutch, later becomes New York, owned by the British. But the real turning point for Jewish immigration comes in the 19th century. You first have German Jews coming in the first part of the 1800s, early 1830s, 1840s. And then after the American Civil War, in the second half of the 19th century, you have large populations of Jews from Eastern Europe, from Russia, from Poland, from Ukraine, from Lithuania, coming to New York City, so that by 1920, the New York City's Jewish population is about 1.6 million, about 29% of the entire city's population. Now, eventually, those Jewish families disperse. Some go to upstate New York, some go to New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, other states. And of course, there were Jewish families that were coming to places like Boston and Baltimore and other cities further south, like Charleston, South Carolina, and Atlanta. But New York ends up having a huge concentration of Jewish families and immigrants. And even today, New York has a very large Jewish population. New York City has the largest Jewish population outside of Israel. So that is a good segue then to talking about New York City, which when you signed up for this lecture on New York State, you probably thought that was going to be the bulk of it. You probably didn't realize that I was going to spend about 50% of it talking about the rest of New York. But the rest of New York is a fascinating place historically, and I encourage you to visit as much of it as possible. There's actually, even before I get to New York City, it's worth mentioning some of the really fascinating museums that exist in New York State as a whole. As I mentioned, there's a museum dedicated to glass called the Corning Glass Museum. There's a museum dedicated to carousels called the Carousel Museum. There's a museum dedicated to kazoos, the instrument that you blow into. There's a kazoo museum. There's also the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. There's a museum dedicated to the women's rights movement called the Women's Rights National Historical Park. There's a New York State Military Museum. There's an antique boat museum. There's a museum dedicated to Jell-O called the Jell-O Gallery Museum. And there's a very famous TV personality from the 1950s called Lucille Ball. And there's actually a Lucille Ball Museum as well in upstate New York, which I have been to. All right, let's talk about New York City then. So this is a view of what would become New York City. Was deemed to look like in 1651. So you can see here, there's not much. The New York City that we have today doesn't look very similar in 1651. New York City, what we think about New York City today was actually settled. Originally there were Lenape peoples there, other indigenous tribes. You can see them represented in this picture, settled by European explorers, by the Dutch, right? So Dutch originally called it New Amsterdam, and that's what you see here, New Amsterdam. Eventually, it gets taken over by the British and gets changed to New York. But the original New Amsterdam, there's still remnants of it in Lower Manhattan. And there's a lot of interesting things we could say about it. We don't have time to go into all of it. I could do an entire hour just on New York City alone. There's literally tens of thousands of books about New York City history. One thing that's interesting is if you look at the maps of what becomes Lower Manhattan, you'll see this right here. This is the Battery. The Battery still exists, right? So this is a fort designed to defend Lower Manhattan because already the Dutch and the British recognized how strategic a port this was, being connected on both sides by water, and then from there out into the bay and into the ocean, incredibly advantageous commercially and militarily. So this Battery down here, there's still remnants of this in Lower Manhattan today. You can go visit it. And it's why it's called the Battery. There's a song about how the Bronx is up and the Battery's down. This area today is called Battery Park City. So that historical legacy is still there in New York. The other thing that's worth noting about it, when it was a Dutch colony, you'll see there was this canal here. And this canal would bring goods up and down from the East River, or become the East River, into New York City proper and then back out into the East River. That canal eventually gets filled in because it stinks. It gets filled with garbage and trash and manure and all kinds of things. If there's one thing that's consistent about New York's history, it's how dirty and smelly it is. If you look at every century, in every era, people are complaining about how dirty and smelly New York is. That was no exception in the 1660s. It was dirty and smelly even back then. This gets filled in, eventually becomes what today is Broad Street. Up here, you see the Battery. The Battery here leads to this big, long way here. This is Broadway. So eventually this becomes Broadway and goes all the way up to Upper Manhattan and into Westchester County. And this right here is a wall. And guess what? That becomes Wall Street. So the Wall Street that we have today, it gets its name because there was originally a wall here when the Dutch settled it. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this map, when you think about maps of New York City today, you often think about it oriented north to south, right? New York, or New Amsterdam, then New York, it was oriented east to west. What do I mean by that? Well, basically, the original vision for the city was that you would come in from the east here, you would dock here, and you would bring goods here going east to west. So the streets are aligned east to west, not really north to south. And that continues with the way New York is laid out up until about the end of the 1700s, early 1800s, when a new plan is put together to lay the city out more in a grid and more in a north-south direction. So that's kind of interesting when you go to New York City today and you go to Lower Manhattan. Think about a city that was oriented from river to river, from the East River to the Hudson River, right? From east to west, as opposed to a city that is oriented from north to south, right? From downtown to uptown. Changes your perception about how New York is put together. Now, I skipped over this slide here. I'm going to fast forward through a lot of history, obviously, because we don't have time. But at one point, New York City is actually the capital of the entire United States. It's the capital from 1785 to 1790, and George Washington is actually inaugurated as president in 1789, the first president of the United States in New York City at a place called Federal Hall. That's what you see in this picture. Federal Hall still exists. You can go visit it today. This is the expansion of New York City, as I talked about. And New York eventually grows and grows so much with immigration and with business and with commerce, and it gets so dirty that they decide to put a huge park in the middle of it. And that park is Central Park. You can still go visit Central Park today. One of the beauties of 19th century America. Now, New York continues to grow and grow in the late 1800s into the early 1900s because of immigration. We talked a little bit about the Jewish immigration, the Italian immigration, the Irish immigration. Immigrants from all over the world come through Ellis Island into New York City. Many of them stay, some of them go to other places, but it just grows and grows the city so much. And it's not just the population, but also changes the whole dynamics of the city. It really becomes such a bustling, dynamic, diverse commercial epicenter with all types of people doing all types of business and all types of exchanges happening in the streets of New York City, which you see in this picture today. And of course, it's not just immigrants, it's also migrants from other parts of the United States. New York City eventually has a huge African-American and Black population, many of which come up from the South, the American South, after the Civil War, and settle in places like Harlem, for example. You've probably heard about Harlem. You've heard about the Harlem Renaissance, this amazing flourishing of culture and art and music that happens. So New York really becomes this hugely diverse, densely populated, incredibly energetic and electric place in the 1800s and into the 1900s. And if you thought New York is crowded now, you should see pictures of what New York looked like in the 19th and early 20th century. These are pictures of Times Square in the 1930s and 1940s. You could see cars everywhere, buses everywhere, trolleys everywhere, construction everywhere, people on every corner. In some of these pictures, you can see a vaudeville theater in the background. You can see, what becomes where the ball drops on New Year's Eve here in Times Square. I mean, New York has always been synonymous with construction, with people, with crowds, with noise, with smells, with sounds, with sights, with tastes. It's an amazing place to soak in, but it can also be a lot. Obviously, the skyline of New York also changes a lot throughout the 19th and 20th century. It's really interesting how much of New York gets built in the 1930s, the New York that we recognize today. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center, the Waldorf Astoria, the Triborough Bridge, the Henry Hudson Bridge, the GW Bridge, the World's Fair grounds. All this is built in the 1930s, and you can still go see all of this today. And of course, in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, Lower Manhattan, which had fallen on hard times, the city was nearly bankrupt, it gets revitalized with the World Trade Center and the growth of the financial district. So New York City today, this is Grand Central Station, another amazing landmark to see in New York City. New York City today continues to be this dynamic, diverse, incredible place, which I highly encourage you to visit. Of course, today we not only have immigrants from Ireland and Italy and Eastern Europe, but we have immigrants from the Middle East. We have immigrants from Latin America. We have immigrants from Russia and China and the Philippines and Mexico, who make our city just an incredibly diverse and exciting place to live. Any type of cuisine you can get in New York, any type of language you want to hear, you can find it in New York. Any type of cultural history or heritage that you want to explore, you can find it in New York. New York really is a crossroad of civilizations, of religions, of cultures, and people. It is the most amazing city in the world. I am biased, of course, having been born and raised there, but it is an incredible place to visit. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about Long Island. We talked about the Catskills being an escape from New York City. Well, Long Island also becomes an escape from New York City. Long Island is obviously famous for its Levitt towns, its suburbs that get built up over the years, people moving from New York City onto Long Island to escape some of the crowds and some of the noise and density and smells. But Long Island also becomes famous for its beaches. And you can see here in this map, this illustration by Richard Scarry, who is a very famous illustrator, some of the beaches on the shores of Long Island. And eventually, if you get all the way out to Long Island, you will get to a very famous lighthouse, the Montauk Point Lighthouse, located at the very tip of eastern Long Island. It gives you 360-degree views over the Atlantic Ocean. This lighthouse was actually commissioned by George Washington in 1792. It's the first lighthouse in New York. It's the fourth oldest working lighthouse in the U.S., and it is a National Historic Landmark. And once you get past the lighthouse, it's the Atlantic Ocean, and then on the other side of that, it's the rest of the world. So New York really is a gateway. It's a gateway to the rest of America through the Erie Canal. It's a gateway through the rest of the world, through the harbor, the river, the ocean, and Long Island. And it has been a gateway for people from around the world to come in, to find freedom, to find work, to find energy, creativity, inspiration, and ultimately, as much amazing history and topography as New York has as a state, ultimately, it's the people that have made New York great, whether it's immigrants, whether it's construction workers, whether it's entertainers, celebrities, stock traders, creatives, and artists. You can find all of it in New York. It's what makes it such an exciting and energizing place to be born, to grow up, to visit, to live. And I hope in this very, very brief hour, I've given you just a small taste of what makes New York my favorite state. I will always heart New York. So thank you for your attention. I apologize that we couldn't go into things with so much depth because there's just so much to cover. But in the few remaining moments that we have, I will try to answer one or two questions. I see, what is your favorite place in New York as a question? Well, this depends if we're talking about New York City or New York State. If we're talking about New York City, I have a number of favorite places. When I was growing up, one of my favorite places was the old Yankee Stadium. So Yankee Stadium is in the Bronx. Bronx is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. We didn't even talk about how the 5 boroughs of New York City came to be. There's Manhattan, Bronx, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Queens. And I used to love going to New York Yankees games at the old Yankee Stadium. The old Yankee Stadium was loud. It was, after a while, it was a little run down. It was kind of grungy. It wasn't the most luxurious of places, but it was such a fun place to watch a game. There were so many interesting characters in the crowd. You were never bored there. It was always exciting. And there were so many cheers and so many songs and so many things that would happen in the stands of a game on any given time, any given night. It was really a magical place to see a baseball game. Also, my grandmother lived in Brooklyn growing up, and so I always loved going to her neighborhood in Brooklyn. And as I got older, I actually really loved going to Greenwich Village, which is an area of New York City, which has a lot of artists and a lot of restaurants and bars and nightclubs. And I was a musician for many years, so I actually played a bunch of shows in the Village, and I really loved that. Upstate New York, I love the Catskills. I love the Finger Lakes, and I love just going to some of these small towns in upstate New York where there are very few people, and just getting a cabin or a house and enjoying walks in the mountains or along the lakes and rivers, and just enjoying all the beauty that New York has to offer. Someone is asking about Dirty Dancing being set in the Catskills. Are the bungalows still available to rent there? So the Catskills has changed a lot. And many of the places that people used to rent have closed down. and some of them are actually abandoned. So there are some like quote unquote ghost towns in the Catskills that you can visit that have abandoned hotels or abandoned bungalows, but in their place have come other places to rent. So if you go on Airbnb or VRBO or just booking.com or any of the other sites, you can find cabins to rent, you can find hotels to rent, you can find other experiences that you could have in the Catskills. People have farms that they rent out rooms in. So the Catskills still have a lot to offer, even if some of these places have closed down. What is your favorite dish? Can you recommend a place in New York where we can try it? So my recommendation when you go to New York City would be to eat some Chinese food. I know that may not be what you expected, but Chinatown in New York City is amazing. There are so many scents and flavors in the air, so many exciting dishes to try. And many of the best dishes that you can get in New York's Chinatown actually will they will not be in English. In other words, there aren't really English equivalents for the names of some of these dishes. So the best bet is just to go into the restaurants and ask the chefs or the wait staff or the owners what they recommend. And they will give you some really unique Chinese food that you've probably not had anywhere else. Keep in mind, China is a huge country with lots of diversity. So Chinese food from the north is different from Chinese food from the south. From Hunan is different from Canton. So depending on which restaurant you go to, you also get more spice, less spice. You'll get lamb, you get beef, you get chicken, you get seafood. It's worth trying all of it. Obviously, if you go to New York, you should also try some pizza. I don't have a specific place to recommend, but just eat a lot of pizza when you're in New York, and you'll enjoy lots of good slices. And then if you get a chance, you could go down to 13th Avenue in Brooklyn, where all the Jewish bakeries are. You can get yourself some pastries, some rugelach, some bagels, some other really yummy baked goods. So those would be some of my recommendations. Last question, and then unfortunately we have to end it. By the way, if you want to ask me more questions, you can find me on the web. Just Google my name. I have a website, and from there you can send me questions directly if you're ever visiting New York, or you want some recommendations, or just want to know more resources for New York history. Can you please share your most impressive experiences connected with New York places of art? Which was a gallery or museum do you remember? What is a favorite type of leisure for typical New Yorkers? Okay. Well, I don't know if there is a typical New Yorker. New Yorkers are so diverse. There's 8 million people living in New York City at any given time. But certainly New Yorkers love to go to our parks, whether it's Central Park or Riverside Park, or in Brooklyn, there are a number of large parks. There's Fort Greene and Fort Tryon. So there's lots of different parks that New Yorkers love to get out of their houses and get off the subway and go into our parks. So that's a sort of a typical New York thing, I guess. In terms of art, I mean, New York is an amazing place for art. You have the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You have the Museum of Modern Art. A little hidden gem is the Cloisters up in Upper Manhattan. That's a really fun place to see art. You can also go to some of the more historical museums, like the New York Historical Society or the Museum of the City of New York. They have art on display as well. There's the Frick Gallery, which has some really interesting art. There's the Neue Gallery, which has some interesting art. All of it's really cool. All of it's really interesting. It's a great place, especially on a hot day. If you go to New York in the summer and you want to be in the air conditioning, go into the Met, go into MoMA, go into the Frick, go into the Neue Gallery, go into the Guggenheim, soak in the AC, and also enjoy some amazing, beautiful artwork. Me personally, I like going to the New York Historical Society. The New York Historical Society has a lot of objects of New York's history. They have a lot of maps, a lot of drawings, but they also have paintings. And some of those Hudson River School paintings are actually in the New York Historical Society, in addition to being in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Washington National Gallery in Washington, D.C. So I would suggest some of those. I also used to work at some of the smaller museums in New York. So there's a museum called the Museum of Chinese in America, which tells the story of Chinese immigrants. And there's also the Museum of Jewish Heritage downtown, which tells the story of the Holocaust and life after the Holocaust. So there's no shortage of good museums in New York to visit, and those are just a few of them. All right, we are at about 2:05 p.m. Eastern time here. I want to thank the American Center in Moscow for this opportunity to talk about New York, my favorite state. my home. It will always be my home, regardless of where in the world I live. Thank you so much for joining us. This is part of a weekly speaker series that they're doing, continuing throughout 2026 with all 50 states. So please join us next Wednesday, May 6th, 8 p.m. Moscow time, for the next event in the series, which will be on the state of Connecticut. Connecticut, right next to New York. A lot of New Yorkers, well, not a lot, but some New Yorkers actually end up leaving New York and moving to Connecticut. So Connecticut itself has a very interesting history, connected to New York, connected to the rest of New England, and it's definitely worth listening to that talk as well. Thank you all so much for being here. I hope you learned something. I hope you get a chance to visit New York, and be well, and hopefully I'll talk with you soon.